everyone, welcome to another Camera Jabber video. Today I'm speaking to Kim Grant, who's a photographer based in Scotland. Hi Kim, how are you?
Hi, I'm really well, Angela. Thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, good, thank you very much. Have you been able to get out very much recently to take some photographs?
Not really. I mean, I'm quite lucky in some ways. I live in the countryside, so I have been getting out most days for my daily walks or cycles. And because I'm in the countryside, I have taken my camera with me a few times and started doing a bit of macro photography. But my usual landscapes, I've not obviously been able to get out and do that during lockdown, but still getting a little bit of photography in during this time, which has been nice.
Yeah, and it's nice to get that break, isn't it? Go out, take a few photographs, just kind of get in the zone of
Oh,
photography.
definitely. I think if we weren't allowed out, for a bit of exercise, I'd be going a bit crazy just now. So yeah, it's nice to remain creative and remain connected to nature during these
Yeah,
challenging times.
great. Now you've kindly agreed to give your 5 top tips for landscape photography.
Yeah, that's correct. I've got 5 photographs to share. Each photograph's got a different story around it and a different tip to sort of things I've learned since I started photography 11 years ago that I've found make more visually appealing images. So I'll be sharing that with everybody today. This is the first image here that I'm going to share with you all, and it's to try and depict or show this idea of the rule of thirds. Now, this image isn't the best in many ways in terms of technique, purely because the rocks in the middle are a little bit out of focus, and we've obviously got this very obvious sun flare going on here. But the great thing about this image is that you've got that rule of thirds aspect within it, which is a really good way compositionally to add a 3D effect to your images. So you often find when people get into landscape photography, especially, that they tend to take what I maybe refer to as kind of snapshot images as they're getting used to their cameras, used to the landscape. And they sometimes just take a little bit of time to sort of get used to being out and about in nature, used to the changing conditions. And the composition, I find, is something that can take a little bit of time to get used to and get your eyes adapted to. But by creating what is known as the rule of thirds, you create this layered effect. So you put something in the foreground of your image, something in the middle, and something in the background. So here we've got this very prominent rock in the sort of foreground area with the sea going around it, the other rocks in the middle, and then you've got the sunset in the background. But the other point I want to make about this image is the idea or the fact that the lights can change very quickly in landscape photography. And this image here, as you can probably see, there's a lot of cloud in the sky. And this night that I was out, I wasn't expecting to get that nice golden glow that you expect during sunsets. But right at the last minute, the sun poured through this very tiny gap in the clouds on the horizon, allowing some light to be cast on the landscape. Now, I said technically this image isn't the best, and that's purely because this light and this beautiful colour came out of nowhere. So I was rushing around, and I literally had about 20 seconds to capture this photograph. But what it sort of shows is that sometimes you'll be taking images very quickly in the field as you're adapting to the light, and you'll sometimes come home and notice things in your image that you may not have noticed before. And as you'll see, or hopefully see, on that prominent rock at the bottom right-hand side, there is a face in it, which I never saw on the evening, because I was looking at that rock before this light came out and hit it, and it was quite flat, quite boring, not very interesting. But having that golden light on it has really illuminated parts of the rock, which give this look of a face shape looking out into sea, which was a lovely surprise when I got home in many ways, and also shows that when you're out in the landscape and out in nature, that light really can transform the landscape around you and allow parts of the landscape that aren't visible in other conditions to become more prominent. And looking out for these things can really help you take more visually appealing images and showcase parts of the landscape which other people may not notice exists. So rule of thirds is something that I always like to talk about because, like I say, it's really good to have that 3D effect in your image. And I always say to people to try and stay away where possible from putting your horizon in the centre of your photograph, because often it doesn't make the most visually appealing image. However, the one time that I stress that it's very important to put your horizon in the centre is when you're photographing reflections. And I personally have found that this is one of the only times when a central horizon works really, really well. And this is because you're wanting to create that mirrored effect. So if you're out and there's a beautiful sunrise or a beautiful sunset, and you're at a waterside location and you've got those beautiful reflections, Putting the horizon in the centre of your frame can allow you to create that exact mirror of what's going on in the sky being reflected on the water below. But one mistake I find people make, and I used to make this mistake all the time, is that I'd get so in depth and sort of in awe with the sunrise or sunset and these beautiful reflections that I would just take the photograph as a reflection image, but without any focal point in it. So what this image here is showcasing is, although it's quite a subtle thing, you've got these sticks sticking out from the water here. And what that does is it allows you to create a little bit of a focal point, but also allows you to potentially showcase where you are in the scene. So like I said, this is quite a subtle focal point in this image. That without these three sticks in the water, it would have been a very flat image. There wouldn't have been anywhere for the eye to sort of engage in. And although it would have been nice in some ways, because you've got the beautiful colours and shapes, just having something in the water or something to focus the eye on can really tell more of a story in your image and create that 3D effect, a more visually appealing image that you really sort of want to do when you're capturing landscape photography. So think about the mirror, but also think about what else you can put in that shot to create that visually appealing image. And one thing that you can also do, or that's quite popular to do, is if you're photographing in the sea or in a loch and you've got a boat, for instance, that can be a really good focal point with the reflections around it. But getting creative when you're somewhere where there's not something like that, using things like this sticks, or something that's often present is rocks and boulders in the water, that can create a really good focal point with the beautiful colours and reflections around it. So moving on from that, this image sort of showcases this idea of a focal point. And one great thing that you can do compositionally when taking images is to try and find something that you can centre in your frame in order to just create that focus for the viewer's eye. And in this image here, this was taken at the Callanash Standing Stones on the Isle of Lewis. And obviously with standing stones, you've got that prominent stone in the middle of the circle. So in this image, I positioned that bang in the centre of the photograph. But I was also incredibly lucky that day to have this rainbow as well, which is also in the centre of the frame, which really focuses the viewer's eye in on what's going on. But you don't just want a focal point in the centre with nothing much around it, or if you do, you want to ensure that it's very mirrored and very balanced. So this image here kind of showcases that. So you've not got too much going on in this image, but what you have got is you've got exactly the same sort of each side in many ways. So if you look at this image closely, on the bottom left, you've got much larger stones than you do on the bottom right of the frame. Now this was completely unintentional, but on the day I was incredibly lucky to also have this mirrored in the clouds. So what you'll see is at the bottom left, you've got the larger stones, but on a diagonal to this, you've got more clouds on the top right, which adds that balance in the frame. And equally, on the opposite to that, you've got the smaller stones on the right-hand side, and diagonally on the top, you've got less cloud on the left-hand side, which creates that balance. So if I'd retaken this image and all the big clouds were on the left-hand side, along with the big rocks, it would have been a very unbalanced image because you would have had quite a lot of negative space and not as much going on the right-hand side with this heavy weight on the left. Like I say, this image was incredibly lucky. The fact that I had the rainbow bang in the centre, which also went along with the larger stone, and the fact that the clouds and the conditions were mirroring what was going on the landscape. But this is just to give you an idea of, you know, creating that balance in your image, but also having that focal point which tells a story and makes it really important. And just to kind of think about what you're sort of doing with your images and where everything is being placed, so that you're not putting too much emphasis on one part of your image. And you've got that unbalanced side. So just something to think about when creating compositional images and sort of learning or viewing where to put certain things within your frame. So one thing people sometimes do when they're shooting landscapes is they tend to feel like they always have to shoot in landscape orientation, because landscape photography, naturally you think of that landscape orientation. But quite often I like to shift that around and shoot in portrait orientation. And what this does is it just sort of focuses the eye in on something that little bit different, and in some ways tells a bit of a different story. So you very rarely see people, I guess, talking about photographing in portraits. It is becoming more popular, especially now with things like Instagram, because generally speaking, portrait images look slightly more visually appealing on Instagram than landscape orientations. In the whole landscape photography field, generally speaking, you don't see that many portrait orientation images. So one thing I like to teach is to kind of get away from that and showcase this idea that, you know, don't be afraid to turn your camera around and try the portrait orientation. And this day I took quite a few images, both landscape and portrait orientations. And I found that the portrait ones worked much better. So here you've got the sort of foreground, middle ground and background that I spoke about earlier, doing the sort of rule of thirds within your image. But you've also got interest going in here and the idea of a leading line. So I found this rock formations which naturally leaded in to the famous Bofido rock that's on the Moray coast up here in Scotland. And having this sort of natural leading line with the rocks leads the viewer's eye in quite naturally to the famous sea stack. And you've also got this motion around the rocks which adds interest to the scene as well. But if I'd shot this in a landscape orientation, it would have cut off quite a bit of what was going on here. And I also found when I was shooting in landscape orientation, there was a lot more sea in my image than this interesting movement and interesting leading line going into your photograph. So just something to think about moving forward. Don't always feel like you have to shoot in landscape orientation. Switch up from time to time, and you might actually notice that you'll see things in the landscape, especially with the terms of leading lines, that you may not have seen shooting in the more stereotypical way. This final image here is another quite good point to make. So when people think about landscape photography, generally speaking, they think about shooting at golden hours. Everybody will get up early and shoot around sunrise or stay out late and shoot around sunset. And of course, that's the times of the day when you're going to get those beautiful colours, the beautiful contrasts, and you're also a lot more likely to get beautiful light. And it can be in some ways easier to get interesting images. But I also say to people, especially people who work a lot and maybe can't be out at these golden and optimum times a day, never feel put off about going out during the day with your camera as well. Now, often it won't be ideal for landscapes because you'll either have really harsh light if it's sunny, or you'll have very grey overcast light, which can create quite dull and boring images. However, being out and about during the day, especially in changeable weather conditions, you can end up with some really interesting light and really interesting scenes which you may not often get on a sort of stereotypical day. So going out during stormy weather or that changeable weather fronts is a really good chance to utilise the daytime hours to do your photography. So this photograph here was actually taken pretty much around midday. It was taken in the autumn time, and as you can see, there's a lot of grey in the clouds here. And literally 10 seconds before I took this photograph, it was very grey, very dull. The light wasn't very nice at all. But out of nowhere, the sun came through the clouds and illuminated the landscape around these people walking along the beach, which allowed the beach huts to show these very vibrant colours. It allowed the highlights and the textures and the sand dunes and the marram grass to show, but it also created these very interesting shadows on the sand and these lines which created that contrast within the image. So I always like to show this image to show that being out and about in nature and in the landscape can be very unpredictable, and don't always feel like you have to go out at those optimum times of day, because sometimes you will go out and you will be greeted with beautiful light, like I say, especially when the weather is changing, and you can be greeted with images that you maybe otherwise wouldn't expect. So yeah, I like to just advocate these things, that there's very good ways to create good compositions in your image. The stereotypical and well-known ways, such as rule of thirds and mirroring and reflections, but also think a little bit outside the box when you're doing landscape photography. Don't be afraid to do portrait orientation, and don't be afraid to go out during the day and the times of day that aren't classed as optimum, because often if you go outside what is classed as the norm, that's potentially where you're likely to get the more interesting, unusual images, because you're shooting at times of the day and being a little bit more creative than what's maybe deemed as the norm. So don't let anything put you off getting out with your camera. There's so many opportunities out there for all of us, no matter what the day, what time of day, whatever your ability is. And really it's about getting out there, practicing and learning, and that's what's going to make you a good photographer at the end of the day.
Thanks, Kim. I think that's a really good point, actually. The most important thing about photography is getting out and taking photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And as you bear in mind the guidelines that you suggested, for example, you're talking about rule of thirds. When you first start photographing, as you say, people don't necessarily know about the rule of thirds, and you take snapshots. And when you start to apply the rule of thirds, and you have to really think about it, but after a while it becomes more instinctive, doesn't it? So, the shot you were saying, the first image you showed, you said that you only had 20 seconds to take that shot to get the right light. Actually, you don't have to think about the rule of thirds. It becomes automatic. So you automatically apply it, and you make better use of that short amount of time, don't you?
Definitely, you certainly do. Getting out with your camera is the only way you're really going to learn. You can sit inside and learn all these techniques and master them in your brain, but you actually need to be out there and repeating the process over and over again. And then, as you say, it becomes instinctive, so that then when you are greeted with these unusual conditions or optimum conditions, you are ready to take that photograph, and you're not faffing around thinking about things, because you've been out there and practiced so many times. And I actually find as well, when people start photography, a lot of people get quite apprehensive or hooked up on the technical side of things, and they kind of think, oh, I can't do this is too much to think about. But the only way that you can get past that is to get out, try time and time and time again, and practice. Like anything in life, the more you practice, the better you're going to become. But the great thing about photography is, it's a mindful thing, it's a creative thing. So even if you go out and you don't come back with those beautiful images that you hoped for, you've still been out in nature, you've still been connecting with it, and you've still got something from it. Even if it's not a photograph you want, you've learned from it and you've had an experience, and that spurs you on to get out time and time again. And in time, your ability and what you see will improve.
That's a really good point, because it is about enjoyment as well at the end of the day, isn't it? Getting out and experiencing nature and taking a few photographs. And also, like anything that you learn, you don't have to do it all at once. You can learn bits in stages. So it might be for quite a while you have to think about rule of thirds, and then later on you always shoot in landscape format, but maybe then you can move on and start thinking in portrait format. Just do it in bite-sized chunks to make it easier for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's so many different aspects to photography. And I mean, even, thinking about landscape photography, there's so many different scenes you can photograph within that, from seascapes to mountainous ranges to lochs. No matter what genre of photography you're interested in, there's so many different aspects to it. But I guess you just have to think about what you want to get out of it. And for me, I got into landscape photography because I love the outdoors and I wanted to connect with it on a more deeper level. And I found going out and sort of stepping back from my everyday life and fully immersing myself in the conditions and getting creative with what was going on is, why I got into it and why I enjoyed it. So, if you like being out in nature, you like being outdoors, you'll enjoy the process as a whole. And like you say, you can just build on things. Maybe once a month you can focus on, your composition. The next month you can think more of your settings, or change up where you're photographing, because photographing a seascape, which is what I do the majority of the time, has so many different challenges that you maybe wouldn't get in certain other regions. And then photographing in mountainous regions will have other challenges that you maybe wouldn't get if you're down in a valley or in a woodland. So, finding your niche, I suppose, finding what you enjoy photographing, taking that time and evolving will really help you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kim, for sharing your images and your insight. It's been really, really interesting.
Oh, you're very welcome, Angela. Thank you for inviting me along.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.